When I decided to become a professional wrestler, I had no idea where it was going to take me. It was Ted who got me into the business and made all the arrangements for my first match. And when I needed a ring name, it was Ted who came up with Dynamite Kid. Over the years, certain promoters tried to tell me the name was no good, and that I should change it, but I never did. My first professional match was against a man called Bobby Hems, in Malvern Wells, near Birmingham. I met him before the match, we shook hands, and he looked down at me and smiled. Well, you can guess why. All he could see was a nervous, skinny kid about to make his debut. What he didn't know was how much knowledge and experience I had from the 3 years I'd just spent with Ted Beckley. I remember sitting in the canteen with Ted, having a cup of tea before the match and feeling very nervous. A man, who I didn't know, came in and started chatting to Ted, who pointed at me and said, "This is the Dynamite Kid. He's a wrestler, do you want his autograph?" The bloke said, "Yeah, okay." And then quick as anything, Ted turned to me and whispered, "Tommy, can you spell Dynamite Kid?" I said, I think so, Ted." That was the first autograph I ever signed. Then I went to the dressing room to get ready for the match. I'll never forget what it felt like, standing behind the curtain, waiting to hear my name. I was terrified, not of getting in the ring, but of the people, a sold-out crowd, watching me wrestle. It's funny how, 12 years later, I stood behind the curtain at the Silverdome in Pontiac, Michigan, looking out at a crowd of 92,000 people. That was WrestleMania 3, and I remember standing there, completely relaxed, cigarette in one hand, cup of coffee in the other, waiting for Rule Britannia to start playing before we walked down to the ring. But on this, my first night, I looked through the curtains, thinking, what am I going to do? Anyway, once the match started and I could think about what I was supposed to be doing, the nerves just disappeared. And Bobby Hems got a bit of a surprise, because all the things I know he was planning to do to me, I ended up doing to him. I think the match went 5 or 6 rounds, and for most of them, I didn't know what day it was because of all the screaming and whistling and clapping coming from the crowd. I won that first match, and right afterward, Bobby Hems was at least polite enough to acknowledge what I'd done out there. Actually, he couldn't believe it. That first match was for a promoter called Jack Atherton, and I stayed with him for a few months while I got the feel of the job. The other wrestlers used to complain that the pay was rotten, but for a 16-year-old kid, it wasn't bad. Jack booked me for a few shows in Wigan, which was great because I got to wrestle some of Wigan's finest, shooters like Alan Woods and the Golden Ace, John Naylor, who also knew the pro job and could give you a fantastic match. Alan Woods, or Tiger Woods, as the magazines used to call him, was, in my opinion, one of the most underrated wrestlers in the country. He never used a gimmick, just came to the ring in his regulation black trunks, and got the job done. John Naylor was a good friend of mine, and being from Wigan, we had a similar sense of humor. I remember one Christmas, one of the wrestlers, a big African called Honey Boy Zimba, wanted a goat for his Christmas dinner. I don't know, maybe that's what they eat over there instead of turkey. Anyway, John Naylor said he could get him a goat from one from the allotments in Wigan. Zimba gave him £8 and said he would meet us at the allotments the next day to pick up the goat. Only when we got there, the bloody thing was already dead. Rigor mortis had set in. John said, "Oh Christ, what are we going to do?" Zimba was going to be there any minute, so he said to me, "Tommy, stand it up and lean it against the shed." So I did, and just then we saw Zimba in his white Chrysler, coming down the drive. John waited until he thought Zimba could see him and then started hitting the goat over the head. As the car got closer, I gave the goat a little push, and it keeled over. Zimba climbed out of the car with a big smile on his face, thinking John had just killed it for him. A few days after Christmas, When John told him how the goat was, Zimba rubbed his fat belly, and said, "Oh, fantastic, man." After a few months I started working for Joint Promotions, which was run by Max Crabtree. His two brothers were also in the business. Brian Crabtree was a referee. Well, actually, he was just a glorified idiot. After the match the villain would throw Brian off the rope, he'd do a cartwheel, land on his feet and then drop kick the villain. Prick. Shirley Crabtree, of course, was Big Daddy. The star? For the first few months I wrestled a lot of different wrestlers, no big names, but slowly, I started working my way up the card. I was always fairly quiet in those early days when I was around the other wrestlers, and kept myself to myself in the buildings. Hard to believe now, I know, but true. Wrestling all those different men, most of them older than me, some with 20 years of experience in the business, made me realize that what I'd learned in 3 years with Ted was more than most of them ever would. There were some bad, and I mean bad, wrestlers. And a lot of them, in spite of being bloody awful, would still try and take liberties with smaller or less experienced men. I soon learned that you had to work a lot harder to make yourself look good against a man who gave you nothing in the ring. In other words, he was only concerned with making himself look good. I met a few of them over the years, too. For a while, quite early on, I was Big Daddy's tag team partner. He was the biggest draw in the country at that time, and the most popular wrestler on British television. What did I think of him? Well, I'll say it. I know he's dead, bless him, but he was a load of shit. Well, what would you think if you were a decent wrestler and someone like Big Daddy hit you with a couple of belly butts, and the people were all going, "Oh." Exactly. The trouble was, Big Shirley wasn't even a nice bloke outside of the ring. Oh, he always seemed okay. You'd walk in the dressing room and he'd shake your hand and smile, and say, Dynamite. It's good to see you." And then as soon as you'd gone out, he'd turn round to the other wrestlers, pull his face, and say, "Nothing but a bastard." I know, because I saw him do the same to everybody. Another thing he liked to do was team up with a little guy, like me, to wrestle tag matches. The little guy would do all the running about and take all the knocks, and, if you remember, we wrestled some big men, like King Kong Kirk and Giant Haystacks. Imagine the size of them wrestling someone the size of me. When one of those fat bastards dropped an elbow, you knew about it. Anyway, I'd always end up getting my head kicked in. I'd manage to crawl across the ring and make the tag, and collapse in the corner. Then Big Shirley would get in, hit them with his big belly, and win the match. After a year or so, the competition got a lot better. I started wrestling Mark Rollerball Rocco, who later wrestled as Black Tiger in Japan. We had some fantastic matches. Like me, Rocco was a hard hitter. He followed everything through and never held anything back. We put 100% into those matches, none of the high-flying stuff at that time, just hard, solid bouts that always excited the crowd. I wrestled Marty Jones, who also went to Japan, but I think he was better known in the UK. Marty also trained with Ted Betley for a while. All the time I was wrestling these people, I was learning from them. I carried on training at Ted's in the afternoons and wrestling at night. On Sundays, my day off, I used to help Ted with a grocery business that he owned, packing potatoes for him. You see, Ted never charged me a penny to train with him. I finally got a shot at a championship belt, the British lightweight title held by Jimmy Breaks. That match was televised from the Guildhall in Preston in front of 5,000 people. 5,000. In England today, you're lucky if you can get 350 people in the building. Jimmy Breaks was, in my opinion, a good little wrestler. I think he held that title 8 times in total, but like a lot of wrestlers he could be a bit, well, two-faced. In other words, you had to be on your guard. Anyway, I beat him for the title that night, which made me, at 18 years old, the youngest British lightweight champion. Ted came along to watch, and after the match he said to me, "Tommy, the world's your oyster now. If you want it, take it." I didn't really understand what he meant then, but that night was the greatest moment of my career, up to that point. Just a few months later I challenged and beat Bobby Ryan for the European welterweight title, right on his own doorstep in Stoke-on-Trent. Now I had 2 championship belts. Max Crabtree was happy, the arenas were doing good business, although that was something he liked to keep to himself, because apart from the very top names, like Big Daddy and Kendo Nagasaki, the pay wasn't that good. Even Burt Royal and Vic Faulkner, who were far better wrestlers, and did draw business, even they were only on about £18 a night. I can remember wrestling a match on a card in Lincoln in 1975. Tony St. Clair had just become the champion. Mark Rocco was on the bill, as well as the African wrestler Honey Boy Zimba. He was supposed to be wrestling King Ben, only King Ben didn't turn up. He probably took one look at the lineup and went home. You see, Zimba, who was a big clumsy bastard, didn't care whether he hurt you or not, and nobody liked wrestling him. Anyway, this night in Lincoln, Max Crabtree was a match short and a wrestler spare. He told Tony St. Clair that he'd have to do a double, because King Ben had no showed. Tony said, "Who with? Zimba? No chance?" So Max asked Rocco, but he wouldn't do it either. In the end there was only me left to ask. I was 16, and I'd been in the ring barely 6 months. Max came up to me and said, "Keed, I need a favor. Will you wrestle Zimba?" I was getting paid about £8 a night at that time, so, as you would expect, I said, "How much for, Max?" Max said, "Tell you what. If you wrestle Zimba, I'll give you King Ben's pay packet." I said okay, I'll do it. We were the last match on the card that night, and normally before then all the other wrestlers would have gone home. But this night, they stayed to watch the last match, well, to watch Honey Boy Zimba break me in half. I didn't win the match, it wasn't even close, but when I walked past those other pricks on my way back to the dressing room to pick up my extra pay packet, I had a big smile on my face. Until I opened it and found £10 inside. I'll give Max Crabtree some credit, he always took care of himself. There was one incident when a German wrestler got involved in a dispute with all 3 of the Crabtrees. What it was about, I couldn't tell you, but he ended up jamming Big Shirley's arm in the door and nearly broke it. He grabbed Brian and nailed him straight in the face, while Max ran off and locked himself in the toilet. In fact, Max Crabtree and money were the 2 main reasons why I left the UK and went to Canada. In the spring of 1978, one held the British and European titles, and I was wrestling hard, 7 nights a week, to defend them. I wrestled a very good match against Rocco in Cleethorpes. Well, we always had a good match, but on this night it was being watched by Bruce Hart, a Canadian wrestler who was in the UK on a 6-week tour. Bruce came to see me after the match, introduced himself and asked if I wanted to go back to Canada with him for a few weeks to work for his dad, Stu Hart, who had his own promotion. He told me I would get a free car, a free apartment, and $400 per week. I didn't know anything about wrestling outside of the United Kingdom. I'd never heard of Stu Hart, or his Stampede Wrestling promotion. But I liked the sound of what he was offering. As usual, I called Ted to ask his advice. Straight away he said it was a great opportunity for me, and I decided there and then I would go. Until I told Max Crabtree. He shook his head and said, "Keed, you're the champion. If you go, you can't come back under the same circumstances." "What do you mean, Max?" I said. "You'll have to forfeit the belts before you go." I said, "But Max, I'll only be away for 6 weeks. It doesn't matter, if you go, you lose the belts. And those Canadian bastards will murder you. But I'll tell you what, if you stay, I'll give you a pay rise. He wouldn't say how much, but he told me not to worry, and that he'd sort it all out. And I cancelled my plans to go to Canada. Now at that time I was getting paid £12 a night. A few nights later I was in Leicester. After the match, Max handed me my pay packet, which contained my rise. When I counted it, he'd paid me £13, and that included expenses. I thought he must have made a mistake, so I said, "I'm not being funny, Max, but what's this?" He just said, "You're only a young lad. That's a lot of money for you." That same night, I rang Ted and asked him to call Stu Hart to see if he would reschedule the Calgary trip. No problem, Stu had told him, or so Ted thought. He'd even pay for my return plane ticket. So it was arranged that I'd fly out at the end of April and come back around the middle of June. And, after that incident with Max and the £1 pay rise, I also decided it was the last time anybody would do me, financially or otherwise. My last match in England was in Chester, just a few days before I left. I was wrestling Rocco. Ted was there, and my dad, as usual, and this time he'd brought my cousin, Davy Boy Smith, to watch the show. He would have been 13 or 14 years old at that time, and he'd just started training at Ted's gym. Even back then, I could see how he looked up to me, saw what I'd achieved, and wanted the same for himself. I left for Calgary, Alberta, Canada, on April 27, 1978, with £20 in my pocket. My dad came to see me off at the airport. I said, "Bye Dad. See you in June?" Well, things didn't go exactly as I planned, and I didn't see him in June. But when I left England that day, I really had no idea it would be 13 years before I'd be back.